Good evening, everyone. Good to be back after a 1-week break. We're getting into week 4 and chapter 4 of the study and the examination we've been doing in the book of Ecclesiastes. One or two times referenced it as the journal, or I guess you can say the diary of Ecclesiastes, the personal writings of Solomon, and really diving into this. And if you haven't been here for some of the classes, or just to kind of hit a quick summary, Solomon comes out and establishes a main point in the book that really works as the theme of the entire book, and it's going to make points throughout the book and use different examples, but all draw back to the idea that everything in this world, everything under the sun, and really what he means by that is everything apart from God, is vanity. And that's kind of important to keep in mind, keep in context, that's really where a lot of these points that he makes and examples that he uses is within that context of under the sun, meaning, below heaven, from this earth, and apart from God. He's talked about some of his experiences and used examples of his own, how we can read about Solomon in 1st and 2nd Kings, and read 1st Kings, read about his life, but he was blessed with great wisdom, great power, great wealth. Talks about his experiences with pleasure, with wisdom, with great projects, great achievements. Same theme, same conclusion. It was vanity for him personally. And then last week 2 weeks ago in chapter 3, kind of took a direction. He kind of started talking about the timing of events and events in one's life, and how we all experience, to some degree, one or another, tragedies, day-to-day grinds, highs, lows, but the events then and of themselves are fleeting, and again, the main point being that they're vain. Of course, vain apart from God, and he has sprinkled in some positive and some points of wisdom through these first 3 chapters, and he's going to kind of do that again here tonight in chapter 4. I warn you, some of the material is not the most positive and uplifting points, but they're important, and it'd be foolish for us to think that one's life is nothing but happy and joyous and innocent times. We all know that there are hard questions in life, hard situations, and hard times that we all face, and that's where growth comes from. And I appreciate Justin's prayer as far as learning something new. The fascinating thing about Ecclesiastes for me, it's a book probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite books, and it's something I guess you can say I don't necessarily learn something new on a surface level when you read these books. You kind of get the general point and the idea of the book, but every time you read through this, you hear somebody else share an example, or you read a commentary. This book has so much depth to it that truly you do learn something new or take something away each time you look at it. So I think it's great we're able to, for 45 minutes or so, look deeper into this. So let's go ahead and get started with chapter 4. So starting in verse 1, he says, "Then I looked again at all the acts of oppression which were being done under the sun. And behold, I saw the tears of the oppressed, and that they had no one to comfort them. But on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no one to comfort them." So again, a real positive introduction here. But notice he says again. Then I looked again. So he's touched a little bit on injustice in the world. There is corruption where there is perceived justice and morals, and there is and he's touched on this point, but really examines on it here. And we can all see that this is one of those points that carries on through time. Governments and regions of the world today, even here in the United States, where we have, our founding fathers tried to create a government that is corrupt-free, but that has not necessarily been the case through history. But it's a fact of human condition and a fact of history that can't be escaped. So moving on to verse 2 and 3. He continues and said, "So I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living. But better off than both of them is the one who has never existed, who has never seen the evil activity that is done under the sun." So this is probably a passage that, first time reading Ecclesiastes or first time explaining this to someone, you kind of look at that and grimace a little bit. It's pretty dark. How could a wise man such as Solomon, an inspired writer, be writing that, it's just better off not even to live? That's actually the most congratulatory person out of all these situations. There's so much oppression and so much evil in this world that I've seen. I kind of wish I was never even born. Wish I never even seen it. How do we explain that? What do we take away from this?
When Jackie and I were first married, and we were talking about like getting ready to start a family. Like I think that's kind of a real fear that I at least had, like him. Like how do you raise faithful children in such a huge place or something? So I don't know that I felt as strongly as that, but that was a reservation that I had because that was a concern of mine. Like man, there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
that's a scary thing that in a practical sense I kind of operated that way.
Totally. No, it's a scary thought. It's a thought that enters everyone's mind, but it's particularly a thought that will enter your mind and probably consume an individual that, again, starts off or lives in a way that this whole book is trying to make a point of, lives only in the context of here under the sun. Only accepts the physical world here as reality, as meaning. And I'm not here to get into a philosophy debate with anybody. This book certainly can lead you in that direction, but it is inevitable when you approach life in that direction and you really take deep dives into thoughts and philosophies, it does lead to some pretty dark places. I saw a hand. Nolan.
What I get from that is that the person who has never been doesn't have to experience the pain and the oppression that these people experience.
Right. If we carry on with the point that all is vanity under the sun, and if that's a reality and a fact that's established, well, if it's vain anyway, I don't want to go through the oppression. And I guess I'm hovering over this point. I kind of wrote some things down and tried to think about, I guess, our society today, maybe my generation. It's probably something you see on the news, more in academia and some of the colleges. Obviously, there's panic and unrest, maybe some factual, some completely overblown about what our planet's going to be like in 50, 60, 70 years in the climate and everything. But there's almost kind of resentment and towards older generations, and you kind of think, I wish I was never even born to have to deal with this stuff in the future. And there's that thought. To me, this whole point has roots in, especially young people, the mental health and the mental health of our society today, and so many young people struggling with finding a meaning and purpose in this world. Sadly, living a life apart from God, and for various reasons having various different experiences in life, but it almost leads to this, and it can lead to some pretty dark places and some pretty dark endings. And then finally, kind of I was thinking about it sort of at a different angle. This is a pretty good way to devalue life and devalue the meaning of life. And, again, not at all trying to bring philosophy or politics into this, but this is one argument I've heard to sort of rationalize the meaning behind why it's okay to have abortions. And, well, it's better off that, if life has no meaning, if this world really is all about the physical world, well, I'm really doing them a favor, and they're not going to go through the oppressions, and it looks like they're going to have a rough life. When you put life and terms into that meaning, it corners you. You go down that thought, it corners you into some pretty dark places. And Solomon's kind of almost not sarcastically, but kind of mocking that train of thought of, if you approach life under the sun, congratulations to the ones who's never even had to experience it, because it's horrible, it's vain. And you sit here and you ponder this stuff, like I say, it can be a little bit, the thoughts can get pretty expanded, but it's an interesting point, and it's one of the hard truths of this book. It's one of the hard truths of our lives, where we have to ask ourselves, what is the point of being here? Where do we go after we die? I think of Robert's lesson this last Sunday, and talking about the different stages of faith. The first two stages being somewhat shallow, new, and trying to learn, but then that critical third stage, someone who's really questioning, trying to research, work out some of the complicated answers or questions of one's life. This kind of falls in line with that. This is sort of how, maybe you start here, but you look to find the answer, and you don't accept this. You try to find the answer to this. And so it's just kind of interesting. These are truths that were written over 900 years ago that obviously still stand today and apply to multiple facets of our society and problems that we face today. So again, nothing new under the sun, right? So does anyone have any points? We'll move on if not.
I just wanted to say, kind of like you already touched on it, that it's juxtaposed to what God says about life. That like when he created man, that he said it was good, and then he created, a mate for Adam. He said it's very good, and be fruitful and multiply. And like God, in God's eyes, it is very, contradictory to this worldly view of life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what life is without God. God is very opposite of that, and it's a very beautiful, good thing.
And we'll read further on in the, obviously if you were to make this argument to folks who have a different point of view, you'd get plenty of rebuttal arguments. And it's interesting to listen to them, but, as we go on, so telling somebody this is pretty shocking. They won't want to hear that. But as we go on, Solomon kind of gives more examples of what kind of an everyday life looks like apart from God, and how it really comes to the same conclusion. So, are there any other points? Any other hands? If not, kind of got ahead of myself. But, how does one make sense, really, of oppression and injustice against the innocent of the world? You look at horrible stories we see of some of the things in the Middle East, and even in our country. If all you have, if all your stock and hope is in this world, it can be pretty depressing. And then kind of touched on the points of how verses 2 and 3 maybe is not extremely common, maybe is something you see on the news, but it's kind of a growing ideology in our culture of sort of nihilism and hopelessness and pointlessness. And it can go in a couple different directions, but so let's move on here. Verse 4. So Solomon says, I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after the wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One hand full of rest is better than two fists full of labor and striving after the wind. So what's he doing here? He's comparing two extremes. He's touched on a little bit of his own examples, and then talking about things that he's observed in previous chapters of one who dedicates their life to labor, to busyness, to their career, and tries to find meaning in that. But what's that point in verse 6? in verse 5, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Folds his hands and consumes his own. What is that? What is he referencing? Wastes away, right? Maybe laziness, one that chooses to not face responsibilities and tasks in life. Really, he's saying both are striving after the win. One may bring you satisfaction and success, pleasure in this life, ultimately is vanity. One, living your life with your hands folded will ultimately lead to ruin and lead to destruction of your life here on earth. But guess what? That too is also vanity. We all face the same reality this point that we've talked about several times already in this class. But it makes kind of the interesting point. One handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after the win. So he's comparing 2 extremes. One who has extreme competition and is dedicated to skill development. I would say this is very prevalent in our culture today. As a young person, as a young man, you're sort of told that you're only as valuable maybe as your job or your career or your income or your status. On a worldly level, yeah, I would say that's true. Under the sun, yeah, I would say that's totally true. And sadly, that's how culture looks at it. And laziness and abandonment of your responsibilities, like I said, really leads to ruin and destruction of your life here on earth. Both ultimately end in vanity, end in nothing. So what is the balance? And this is kind of something, I found this verse. It's Proverbs, the other book of wisdom, just previous. In chapter 15, starting in verse 16, he says, "Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil with it. Better is a dish of vegetables where love is than a fattened ox served with hatred." I like that verse 17. I'm going to tell my kids that. Better eat your food. That is better with love than a filet mignon. But it's so true. Those 2 verses right there, in my opinion, is something that the world completely rejects. Completely rejects, and is completely completely clashes with our culture. Your contentment, being content, being satisfied with what you have, can almost be considered as weak. You're kind of a weak person if you don't have that drive to succeed here on this earth. Just kind of some interesting thoughts. Does anyone have any points? Let's keep moving. So moving on to verse 7, he says, "Then I looked again at vanity under the sun." Again, setting that context, every half chapter, he's sure to make that point. "There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? This too is vanity, and is a grievous task." And it's actually something, he's touched on this also, I believe, in chapter 2. He calls it a great evil. In the context in chapter 2 of saying that, one who spends and dedicates his life building up to all of his riches, and then doesn't even know who he's going to pass it on to. And then after he leaves this earth, has no control of how those assets, money, whatever riches is even going to be used, be completely squandered. And ironically, we pointed out that Solomon himself is the perfect example of this, with his sons and what ends up happening with the kingdom of Israel after he passes. But I guess I'll ask, do any of us know of a person like this? I mean, this is kind of a pretty unique profile, right? He's someone with no family members, no brother, no child, maybe no immediate family member, and it's just dedicated to their labor, to their work. I mean, maybe if you look at it in a literal context, certainly, and I can tell you right now, I know someone that actually fits, I work for someone that fits this exact profile. But you really could look at it as someone that doesn't have a relationship with their brother, doesn't have a relationship with their parents, has sadly, for whatever reason, cut off ties with those around them, loved ones around them, and is dedicated to something that, again, Solomon is using a vain activity or facet of this earth, never once asking themselves, why am I even doing this? I guess I will share my example. I don't like to share personal examples, and certainly don't like to, I guess, speak bad about people, but he's my boss, and he'd be unapologetic about the life he lives. And he is a moral person, an ethical person. We've had conversations about, I've spent 2 hours in the car with him today. We've had conversations about, things other than farming. We talk about, maybe touch on things, what happens after this world, and what really is the point of all this. But he's very quick to step away from that. He really does not want to talk about it. And it's sad, but it's also, it's kind of fascinating. Literally does not have any children, has really no relationship with his family, lives alone, is worth an unimaginable amount of money, has tens of thousands of acres of farmland, and is focused and dedicated 7 days a week to that, to perfecting everything in his career. And I cannot help but bring that example up when literally reading a description of this. And it's kind of sad to see, because the successful and driven life is often a lonely one. And when I say successful and driven, again, in the context of under the sun, okay, it's good to be it's something we should strive for, to be a successful and driven person, successful and driven father, husband, mother, spouse, Christian, okay? The context we're talking about here is under the sun. It's very important. So what does it produce? Produces earthly riches. Okay, you could put about 1 million things in that category of, quote, riches. Literal money, cash, assets, great friends, fame, great experiences, travel, whatever, great, anything. But it really can be bundled up into this category of earthly riches, earthly things. What else does it to produce from verse 7 and 8? Loneliness, never-ending labor. Some people say they truly love their job, truly love what they do, and I'm sure they do in some context, one or the other. But it's kind of fascinating. You see on TV, or I follow sports quite a bit, and you see some of these athletes who've been dedicated to their sport since they were like 5 years old, and have made it their life's goal to reach the pinnacle of their sport. And Father Time being undefeated, you can't keep playing, into your 30s, 40s, 50s, obviously. And many of them have hard time walking away. And if you watch some interviews of the day that they retired, or life after retirement, it shakes their world up, because that is their purpose, that is their meaning, that is what they put all their stake into. And one thing is kind of interesting, and one thing I've heard said is, what if that were to be taken away from you? If you put all your stake and your meaning in your physical appearance, and let's say you're a very attractive person, you're a celebrity, whatever, what if you get in a car and half your body gets burned? Can you find meaninglessness and purpose in this life? Very dark scenario, I know, but it's true. Anything in this world, and it's something we should ask ourselves as Christians. It's a trap that we can fall into. We, of course, know and strive to follow Christ and know that is ultimately where we put our meaning, but we can get caught up in this world. And there's been times in my life where I had to stop and think, if this got taken from me, would I be miserable? Would I completely And then you kind of realize, well, wait a minute, this has kind of consumed me a little bit. And so, we can get kind of off into a couple different points here, but Solomon's really making that point that this individual doesn't have to fit this exact profile, but what he's describing here is a lonely individual. The world would see a successful, rich, great person, great icon individual. In the inside, and what God sees is those things in point number 2. And it's sad. It's a reality. At the older I get, when being young and naive and getting to work around more experienced people, you think, oh, these people are brilliant, they're smart, they know what they're doing, I need to just be quiet and listen. Nobody makes mistakes, no, I can't be that way, like somebody's got it figured out. And you realize these are flawed, vulnerable people that deal with these exact things. And it's kind of humbling, so. Mitch, do you have a point?
I'm just going to say, I had a conversation with somebody that kind of fit the profile, not like this, but he said that it's very successful, well-respected, well-known. You would think this person would be so happy with what they achieved. Very significant financially, reputation. We were just talking about things, and he made a comment, I just wish I was 40 years old. He's in his 70s. So I could just keep going. And lamenting that all the things that he did, he doesn't have the time to continue that. And that's what he was left with. It wasn't about, wow, this is just so great. You would think somebody would enjoy that life, but if you just pursue life without God, and that's all it is, I just saw it play out there.
Well, like what we...
Really interesting conversation.
Totally. No, it's fascinating. It's sad, but like I said, it is also fascinating when you sit there and think about it. And it immediately always drives me to this book. But saying, I wish I was 40 years old again, so I could just what? Re-experience those pleasures, re-experience the grind, the climb. If you notice all these interviews of these great successful people, what will they tell you? What's the most fulfilling part? It was really the come up. It was really the grind and chasing it. That was the best part. Then when I got it, then what? You put all your meaning into that chase and that drive, and that was really it. It's like we said, it's chasing the wind. Solomon uses the word vanity, but when it's translated into Hebrew, it's really used as vapor or like mist, and someone trying to like literally catch vapor or mist. Like we had that discussion, a thought on pleasure. It's a fascinating thing. It's almost like an event that is here and it's gone. It just goes right through you. And this stuff is, we could sit here and discuss this. It's very fascinating. But in pertaining to this individual and someone like this, let's look at a New Testament example. I probably should have put that on 2 slides. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 13, Jesus addresses this exact person. So it says there, someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbiter over you?" Then he said to them, "Beware." Jesus said to them, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of possessions." That is such a fascinating statement. Total paradox there. For not even when one has an abundance, what's he talking about? Abundance of the vain things under this world. So, not even in that situation does his life consist of possessions. What possessions is he talking about? I don't know, living water, bread of life. If you drink this water, the Samaritan woman, she was confused. If you drink this water, you'll never thirst again. Well, I don't understand. I am the bread of life. Anyone who eats of this will never hunger again. In that paraphrasing. But so he continues in verse 16, and he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive, and when he began reasoning to himself, saying," and that's important, reasoning. This individual I told you about earlier is a very reasonable guy, very common sense, very successful guy. He began reasoning to himself, saying, "What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?" Then he said, this is what I'll do. I've got it. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, the reasonable man, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now you will own, and now who will own what you have prepared? That point Solomon talked about. Can't take it with you. So the man who stores up his treasures for himself and is not rich towards God does not have a relationship with God. Okay? I don't have to add much commentary to that. That is exactly what we're talking about here. Jesus exactly talked about this. A few weeks ago, someone raised their hand and asked, is Ecclesiastes really written? Was it written for those in 925 BC and for those around Solomon's time prior to that? Was it written for us today? I think my cop-out answer was both, is that they are truths that apply, eternal truths that apply to the human condition. One more passage in Matthew 34. But when the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered themselves together. They were trying to trick him. One of them, a lawyer, real smart guy, asked him a question, testing him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? We'll get him here. We'll get him. And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the greatest commandment, this is the greatest and foremost commandment. The second, like it, is you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these, the two commandments depend, the whole law and the prophets. Jesus directly spoke to this exact point. It's very fascinating. So, let's keep moving. So, going on into verse 9. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is no one other to lift him up. Further, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. So he's directly playing off the point he made in the previous passage about the person who is truly alone in this world, whether they're successful or not. The point is loneliness and the sadness of that reality. And it's making the point here that we would all agree with. It's good to have a companion, I guess, to have your back. These, you really could preach a lesson on this and kind of go a couple different directions. But I guess I'll ask the question, 9 through 12, how does that directly correlate to us as Christians today? Not just having friends, not just having good friends, good family members. How does that directly? Solomon was an inspired writer. Okay, this is inspired text. How does it translate to today, Robert?
Well, this tells us why the church is a body, why God encourages and commands fellowship and attendance to a body of fellow like-minded individuals when it comes to Christ, because it is through that we can have strength for one another, because God and Christ understand that life's journey is too difficult spiritually to be done on its own.
And you're totally correct. The establishment of the church and really God's plan for his people before the foundations of the earth. So when Ecclesiastes was being written, certainly this applies to the church and what we are today. Go ahead, Dan.
I think it tells us that we have a responsibility to be the one who helps, to be the one who goes to the other one when they're alone.
Yeah.
Gives us our job.
That's a perfect segue into this. And Hebrews 10, a passage maybe some are very familiar with. And starting in verse 22, directly talking about, this is post-Christ, this is the establishment of the church now, and he's talking to Christians, former Hebrew Christians, but really to all Christians, saying, let us draw near with a sincere heart and in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. So talking about becoming a Christian, since we have now all been freed from sin, we are all share this common bond with one another. Picking up in 23, then let us hold fast to the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stimulate one another to love, talking about the church, fellow Christians, and to good deeds, not forsaking our assembly together. He's keyword ours, assembly together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. That's like one of the principal fundamental passages that maybe we've read and been taught for years, but is a truth in Ecclesiastes 4, verses 9 through 12. The whole point of the church, God established, is not to just be a solo Christian in the world. And a few months back, I remember Randy preaching on that, of the importance of coming together. And it's, like you say, sort of almost a duty or responsibility to not just be there for someone when it's good, when their life is good, or when things in the church are going good, but when things are bad. And I have seen it time and time again growing up here, and it's very humbling. I've seen it in a public sense, people who have gone through horrible things, and people who are here in this group who are immediately there for them, but also seen it in the private sense. When people are moving on short notice and ask for help to move, and you show up and there's 10 guys there. That's like the best feeling. And then I've seen at times, and this is just what I've seen someone who has had a surgery, have gotten very sick, horrible tragedy, and needs food, needs care, and you log on to see the food meal list, and there's already 5 people who've signed up before you even looked at it. Those little things, and there's tons of other things that I don't even see. So that's exactly what he's talking about here. And it's a point that directly correlates with us today. But,
There's another thing too, more of a spiritual thing, but where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, they're in the midst of it. So in prayer, even though it's not in a big group, it can be a small group.
mm-hmm. Totally. No, it is something that I tend to be someone who is a little bit more private, and I will deal with my problems on my own. That has always been as I'm sure with many individuals here, people have a hard time being vulnerable, but you sort of not only have a responsibility to be there for someone, which, hey, yeah, I have no problem being there for you. You also have sort of a responsibility to make yourself available for people to be there for you. Probably something that is a little bit more difficult, at least speaking for myself. So, no, it's very fascinating. Again, one of the great things about Ecclesiastes is the direct ties to our lives today. So, closing out chapter 4, he's kind of using a couple different examples, but he kind of turns to a different gear here in verse 13, picking back up. Gives another example. This time he's making kind of a different point. He says, a poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king, for who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of a prison, the poor young lad has come out of a prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all of the living under the throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him, who replaces the young lad who came up. There is no end to all people and to all who were before him, and even to the ones who will come later and will not be happy with him. For this too is vanity and striving after the wind. So like a classic rhythm to Ecclesiastes and what we've been reading is he makes sort of a satire, almost mocking point, kind of an encouraging point. The young lad rises, but guess what? He gets replaced someday too. And you know what? This actually continues on and on again. You know what? This is all vain. Kind of that good fuzzy feeling, right? No, it's something, you have to read 2 or 3 times and really take a close examining look. And really his final thoughts of this chapter The point he's making first is talking about that old king who refuses to no longer take advice. To me, that is, whether you're an old king or a young lad, the point being that he's trying to make, and he's trying to define what a fool is. The true definition of a fool is someone who knows everything, right? Oh, wait, who thinks they know everything. And again, none of us have been guilty of that, right? Great. But in all seriousness, to me, that's the ultimate delusion right there of someone who really becomes a fool in that sense. The second point he makes there is a point he's made before. When we talked about wisdom and folly, and what's a better way to live? Okay, I'll try pleasure and experiencing all these great things in life. I'll try achievements. Well, I'll just try living in a wise fashion instead of a foolish fashion. Well, yeah, it can get you far. And he talks about how, in his life, Solomon, how he's been able to excel in that way. But the ultimate point, again, wisdom apart from God is earthly wisdom, and it's vain. And the final point is just that. Whether someone here on this earth, a great politician, a great leader, makes it up through the ranks, at some point they will be replaced, they will be forgotten. Maybe not forgotten, we know all our presidents, but how often do you think about the 20th president of the United States? That's really the point in your daily life. And, really all is vanity under the sun. We'll see you guys next week. No, I'm just kidding. It's the point he's trying to drive here is that there is really no value in these things here on this earth. And we'll kind of see, going into chapter 5 next week, he sort of takes a different turn. It's fascinating, but I don't know. Maybe spend some time this week rereading it, considering maybe some of your own applications to this chapter and some points that apply to you. And Janine, I'm sorry if you've had your hand up.
Correct. I mentioned a couple weeks ago that you mentioned your boss, and it absolutely applies now. If you've ever watched the History Channel and the Titans that built America,
Oh, yeah.
every one of them, the attitude is like that, and then what happened?
Totally. Yeah, it's a funny thing how history repeats itself, right? The human condition lives on. The way humans live on this earth is not going to change unless they accept the way to live that is not from this earth. We've kind of talked about that last week. If you want to improve your life here on this earth, you have to look for something outside of yourself and outside of this earth. You want the things around you to improve. Stop trying to consume more of the outside things. Fix the internal. And I think we all know, the message, what that really means. So I'll hand.
Well,
Robert, yeah.
two, I think one thing with chapter 4 that's important to notice is it's the same point as chapter 1 and 2. Is if you look at all the things he's talking about with labor, with the young lad that comes out as oppressed, and then he repeats the cycle. It's this idea that everything in life is sin.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the vanity, is it's never going to change. Oppression will always exist. The cycle of oppression is always going to exist. The cycle of the great becoming the old, foolish king will always exist. And the cycle of labor is always going to exist. It will never change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the vanity, is no matter how hard we work, or how much we try to change things, or how progressive we think we are, it's always going to go back to the same thing.
Well, that's totally true, and we kind of made this point of you can look at this book in 3 different ways. Maybe I'm oversimplifying it. First being that a cynical view, kind of a depressing view that nothing's going to change, this kind of downer attitude of reading this book. Almost the second being almost as a satire, as a mocking, that Solomon is saying, you fools, you think you individuals, you great society, you American society in 2024, think you guys have it all figured out, and you've created discovered new truths of this world that we, us ancient people, never knew. these same truths apply to you today. Like, I'm going to predict the future. You're still going to be dealing with these problems in the future. You almost kind of get a mocking term when you read these examples over and over again. And then the third, where I really draw from this is, to me, it's an encouraging book. Again, being all perspective, you make those points of this oppression, all these things never end, this world is terrible, all is vain. Under the sun. But what is so great about the reminder of this book is we are not living for a life under the sun. The whole point of Jesus and the whole point of the gospel is being able to escape all of this and being able to put your life on a path that is something greater than this. So it is, like I said, for depths that we can sit here and talk about for hours. So I hope you maybe spend some time when you're driving in the car, going on a walk, just thinking about these things, thinking of your own examples of your life, things that have happened to you and how they apply. Ecclesiastes, like I said, is a very fascinating book. I chose this topic for a reason. So I'm a bit of a ranter, so you're welcome. Enjoy. You're welcome. But anyway, so we'll move on to chapter 5 next week, and that's. I'm sorry, James.
I was thinking that, in terms of what we're just talking about now, in terms of pessimism and all that, living under the sun, I think that one encouraging thought is when you look at the contrast of Job, when he lost everything, instead of ranting or woe is me, instead he falls on the ground and praises God.
Mm-hmm.
That's where he based his hope in.
Job is a man that chose to take the lessons of this book and follow him in that point 3 fashion of, hey, what I'm drawing from this is I don't want anything a part of the life under the sun, and I'm dedicating my life, or I'm dedicating my meaningfulness of this and my purpose on this earth for something above the sun. So, totally agree. Okay, with that, we'll see you next week. We'll get into chapter 5. So, thank you.